Welcome to the Black Lodge Games podcast. It has been quite a while.
New environment now.
Yeah, new environment. Your super chats are being put to excellent use.
Yes, could not have done it without you.
So we'd like to thank our community for that. But I am Ginger Fraser. If you're new to this podcast, I am joined, as always, by young Steve Buscemi.
Of course.
And we are here to tell the truth about Dungeons and Dragons. No, we're here to basically talk about immersive role-playing games and
yes,
how to make your game better. But we took quite a break from doing this podcast. Now that we're back, though, we had a suggestion for a book that we should read by one of our great subscribers, Primeval Fantasy RPG, and that is, of course, The Elusive Shift. It is excellent. Yeah, this book is about kind of the origins of the hobby.
Which is far more interesting than I would have thought. I would have thought this would have been a dud.
Boring as fuck.
As fuck. No ground to be covered, no new wisdom to be ascertained, but that is absolutely not the case. Things were so much better in the 70s.
Yeah, it's and not just in terms of like game design, but the level of conversation.
Yeah.
Whereas now you have, millennials and Zoomers like us, and the YouTube generation of influencers talking about this stuff in the lowest terms possible.
Yeah.
Like back then, it was these like giga autist, wargamers in Berkeley and MIT.
Yeah, when the barrier to entry was high, and you had actual nerds and not what nerds have now become.
Yeah. Not nerd culture.
Nerd chic, nerd culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting because as soon as D&D became a thing, you had these wildly different interpretations, opinions, and my biggest takeaway was that nothing new is under the sun, right? Everything that we talk about now, everything that the commentariat, such as it is discussing now in, as you say, the most lowest common denominator, brain-dead terms, they all existed from almost immediately after 1974. In 1974, in some cases, what is this new thing? How does it differentiate from war games? Does it differentiate?
Yeah.
What is role-playing? What are we role-playing? Should we be telling a story? Should we be playing sort of an adversarial conflict between the GM and the players? All of this stuff is... and the insights, and again, the conversation was so much better, so much more intellectual, so much more well thought out, right?
Yeah.
Because you did have these people from Berkeley and what have you who were the only ones talking about it. But it was a very insular community, but like frenetic energy.
Yeah, and there was like this gigantic diversity of kind of philosophy in what these games are from the very outset, which was great. This is one of the things when we posted that we were reading about this on Twitter, Runeslinger, of whom we are a huge fan of Runeslinger, he cautioned me, don't get caught up on the fact that, all of the conversations have already been had, that everyone's already said the same thing. But I don't think that you can discount that because it's frightening almost to the level of granularity to which the conversations that are happening now have all been had. And it's like they were had in waves almost.
Yes.
And this was something that towards the end of the book that I realized it's like the whole time is a flat circle thing is completely true. Nietzsche was right. Many such cases. But there's a point at which these older gamers, who took on the moniker of grognards, and they referred to this young generation of people who came in the early 80s as munchkins, where the munchkins grew up and a lot of them stopped playing, but some of them, were the true hobbyists and were still with this. And you get Mark Reinhagen, who, creator of Vampire the Masquerade, writing in one of these publications where he was like, I wasn't around for the last 10 years reading this, so I'm just going to give my perspective on this. And he's using slightly different terminology, he's talking about the exact same things that were talked about within 12 months of the release of the original Dungeons and Dragons. And that was one of the big kind of things that has gone around, at least in our spheres, in like Twitter and YouTube and everything like that. We're faced with these kind of the new gamer, who believes that these games are complete storytelling exercises, fudge the dice, all of this stuff. And this was, had already been talked about previously. But on the other side, you have the old school people who are saying, like, no, basically we need to return to Monkey and go back to the way it was done in the Golden Age. And there wasn't a Golden Age.
No, that this myth that Gary Gygax received the tablets from the mountain and things were good. There was the Golden Age when the prophet came down and revealed the divine wisdom, and then after a certain point, whether it's after AD&D or whether it's after Dragonlance becomes a thing or after it's Vampire comes on the scene, it was a slow decline, to this, Iron Age, Dark Age we live in now. Absolutely not the case. Yeah,
it was never the case that there was any sort of uniformity of play, and that was Gygax, when he released AD&D, that was his attempt to codify everything and get, make this a singular game.
Yeah.
But when the very first edition, but 0th edition, Zero-E came out, it basically had such significant gaps in it that it wasn't a game per se. It was more of a build your own game toolkit. At least that's how people treated it. And
that what would you say? That fact, this being sort of the features of OD&D, it being, if you want to call it a tool set, or if you want to call it an incomplete game, if you want to be more negative, it couldn't be anything but that because of the novelty of the medium, of the hobby. Gygax was just trying to figure it out, just like everyone else has been trying to figure it out since then. It's not as if, as a lot of the OSR crowd might lead you to believe, that this is the way it was back in the day.
Right.
For an explicit reason, where this was all thought out, and everything was conjugated, everything was, tied neatly in a bow to create this specific experience. Again, Gygax did not receive the wisdom from on high. He saw a gap in the wargaming hobby, or a tendency that was already there in the wargaming community, and really did put a lot of pieces together, which resulted in D&D.
Yeah.
But this isn't, a purified platonic ideal of a role-playing game that we need to return to because it was better, right? Because it was complete at one time, and now it's fractured.
Yeah, completely. And that was the thing is, like, and we discussed this, yesterday, that Gygax deserves all the laurels that he has.
Oh, yeah, completely.
It wasn't just that he was first to market with a role-playing game. He was, and it transformed everything, but it was, he seized upon an idea that was in the water, essentially. Yes. This was the thing that was so fascinating about this book, was talking about the wargaming hobby in the 1960s, and even before that.
And even before the 20th century.
Even before the 20th century. There was a lot of role play going on, not in the same way that we do with a single character necessarily within, fantasy genre or whatever. But it was really interesting to see that this wasn't just a product of wargaming. It came out of a lot of different things.
Right.
Like, I'm not even sure if you would classify diplomacy as a war game. Someone said maybe it was more of a strategy game, but
Yeah, I would say it's more of like a board game strategy game.
yeah,
I would say. I haven't thought about it considerably, but
right. But people were playing this like basically play by post via mail.
yeah.
And they were writing like in character propaganda pieces that are like 25,000 words long.
Yeah.
You know, like you cannot claim that these people were not in character. You know, like
If you thought the theater kids were bad now,
yeah, like truly.
imagine getting junk mail from your general.
Oh God. But yeah, there was also this thing called Coventry going on where people were doing these sort of like essentially LARPs. They're showing up in costume and playing out these like almost like Jane Austen style. It sounds terrible to be honest.
Yeah.
But the LARPers were there too.
Everything has always been there.
Yeah. But it was interesting because explicitly like in the war games, people started, you know, in the 60s, they started doing things where they wanted to bring more realism and more simulationism to the world without simply being in reference to simulation of battle mechanics and things like that. So you'll have to forgive me because I don't remember a single person's name in this book. He covers like 500 different people.
Yeah, I'm terrible with names. I don't recall, but the names are less important than the fact
than the ideas
of the discourse and the ideas that were at play.
So there's this guy though who starts basically writing a psychological profile and backstory for every single figurine in his army. He's just putting numbers on the little figurines, and they start doing this in like a lot of people start doing this. And what they're doing is they're finding that by giving them these psychological profiles, personalities, and all this stuff, they're finding themselves a lot more reticent to just throw their troops into meat grinders and trying to incorporate the actual characters, how they would behave on the battlefield based on these different factors.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it was a card or a small piece of paper with a handful of different attributes.
Yeah.
Right. Different small numerical values for different personality traits or something to that effect. You know, which is both interesting and insane.
Yeah.
Doing this for an entire battalion or more than a battalion.
Yeah.
You know, who's to say, you know? I mean, again, but the fact that people were going to such lengths to try and express this sort of urge or this desire. I mean, you're expressing your frustration, even if you don't consciously think of it this way, your frustration at a gap in the world or a gap in the activity that you're doing.
Constantly searching for more.
Yes.
Yeah. And there was a lot of different things too, where they're running these large like war game campaigns, and they were doing this kind of meta level thing, which a lot of people now would refer to like patron play or whatever, where they have people taking on the roles of different rulers, like, and role playing them as you are the cruel king, like emperor, needlessly cruel, you know, and people taking that on and playing it out through these large campaigns. And this is going on before fantasy roleplay is really a thing. Fantasy roleplay, as we know it today, really did not exist before D&D. Maybe if you want to say, you know, Blackmore or whatever, but Dave Arneson helped write D&D, so I'm keeping all of that in the same container.
Yeah, it seemed very much to me like, you know, Gygax was able to articulate and present something, again, that was in the water. And once it was put out there, once it was presented, the science fiction fantasy fandom community, the people who like Tolkien and Star Trek and you know, Moorcock, what have you, really seized upon it and like breathed a whole new extra you know, level of sort of life and energy into this sort of hobby sphere.
Yeah.
Because it seemed very much like the wargaming community and the science fiction fantasy fandom community were fairly separate. It definitely was a Venn diagram.
Yeah, there's a Venn diagram there, but they were very separate, and that was a lot of the kind of popularity when they started hearing about D&D shortly after its release. This brought in this entirely different culture that had no background for the most part in wargaming. There are some people, that Venn diagram, it was usually they were obsessed with both to some insane degree. But you had people who came in with no preconceptions as to what this stuff was. And when D&D comes onto the scene, like we said, like the level of conversation surrounding it was just unbelievable. And what was so interesting was the diversity of playstyles, because there were certain people that very quickly latched on to, oh, this is like this new set of challenges that we have, and there were like the different groups, a lot of times would not accept characters from outside campaigns. There was like this super lethal, absolute mudcore, like you wouldn't even believe groups in Berkeley that like
it really was the Wild West.
Yeah, really was and then somebody shows up 18 months after D&D has been released with a 250th level magic user or something like that. Like they're like, wait, how is this even possible?
Yeah,
like they calculated like the number of experience points you would have needed to gain that many levels over that.
It's funny because it is like, it's bizarre because there wasn't a golden age, and yet like the amount of energy and vitality back then, it does nevertheless kind of seem like there was, because again, it's like if you thought the theater kids were bad, now they had so much more energy before. If you thought the power gamer was bad now, you've never seen anyone come to you with a 230th level character, no matter how much of like a min-maxer they are, right? It was so much more. It's like the dinosaurs. The oxygen level was so high.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, right? This thing called D&D, it absolutely has its lineage in wargaming. It comes directly out of wargaming, but it enters into this new space, and it offers like a voice, or it offers an outlet for this new kind of activity that hasn't been defined at all. Right? Not only has it not been defined, people really haven't been thinking about it or talking about it or even fully conscious of that it could be a thing. And so, okay, and the book makes this point where when a new activity or a new term comes online, there's this tremendous frantic urge to sort of codify it. Yeah. And yet also it's sort of impossible, and it's the worst sort of environment to actually do so. Yeah. Because nobody knows. There hasn't been tendencies or tropes or anything really that's been established over the course of time or tradition or through the hand of the market in any in any way. And so what you have is a lot of really smart autists looking at this, playing it with a crazy amount of focus, even if it's not the focus that you or I would advocate, but recognizing the additional gap, not only the gaps that exist in OD&D, but the implications and the incentives that are inherent in this new kind of game, this new kind of play experience. And so you have some people who think this is just a war game, it should stay a war game. The sort of adversarial relationship between the GM and the players should be maintained because this is this ultimately should be sort of a battle of wits and a competition thing. all the way to the other side to people, like Eisen and other people
Symbolist,
Symbolist, who think this is purely like an exercise in psychodrama.
Yeah.
And mechanics should be eschewed as much as possible wherever possible, and then everything in between.
Yeah, and there's and even between Eisen and Symbolist, there's two very different philosophies, because Eisen, well, ultimately I think the lengths to which he took his attempts to bring immersion to the table and immersion with the players, I do think he was wrong in his kind of ultimate conclusion there, which we'll talk about in a second. Symbolist, on the other hand, was looking at this like he wrote one of these what would be so-called second generation role-playing games. So like Zero E is first generation. It has all these gaps. It's this toolkit. Everybody's filling in. It's like everybody's game is of their own design, because it's just a collection of their house rules. So every table is completely isolated, and there's not as much communication between them as there even is today. And we've talked about this, that even today, the nature of these things is that they are very isolated activities. And so the actual sharing of knowledge is very, very difficult. But Symbolist wrote, what was it? Chivalry and Sorcery, I think is what it was.
Yes.
I believe that's the name of the game, which was another, essentially a huge expansion of the Dungeons and Dragons concept. But he locked on to what we locked on very, very quickly, which is that, oh man, like years ago, like when I was a child, I figured this out. It was like, okay, we're doing the dungeon again. Like we're going into the dungeon again. Like he's like, D&D as written was basically like a system for running isolated adventures in these subterranean environments, and that there's so much more that you can explore with this. And he went very much in the direction, though, of not simply having a living world with living characters that you're playing in, but in the direction of is now basically turned into like story gaming, where he was very much on like your character has a destiny, and this is a destiny that your player almost should help the GM come up with, and it's the GM's job to kind of guide them toward that destiny. And I think he sort of slid more into that conclusion. Yeah.
After time, I found myself agreeing more with him
early on. Yeah,
because
same.
The realization is correct. Not only is there more that you can do, but the game also really is implying that there should be more. We're utilizing all of these mechanics and all of these. You're being asked to frame your perspective from the point of view of a character. If that's true, surely the world outside the dungeon must exist.
Yeah.
And surely, if that's the case, the more human...
It's got to be pretty fucking important to the character.
It's got to be important, but also there are other motivations at play in this human being that I'm portraying, which leads to chivalry and sorcery to, sort of fill that gap. But then as time went on...
Then he starts talking about how...
He got a lot of, like, resistance.
Yeah. Well, and to an extent, like, there's the thing that I really agreed with him on was that he came to the conclusion that, the underlying philosophy of each game defines every aspect of it. And so this idea where people were, even at the time, people were saying you can't have a philosophy to this. Like, what are you even talking? Like, there was one of the funniest things in this book was that two people write in, and it might be in response to one of Symbolist's articles in one of these magazines, and they're like, what even is this article? It's so boring. I couldn't even get through it. And it's just like, you fucking mongoloids. Yeah. like you absolute gremlins.
Get out now.
Get out now. Yeah. Of the gene pool.
Yes.
But he's right. The underlying philosophy of each game is going to affect the entire experience. He then later goes on, though, because he describes that his players were doing much, much more than the dungeon crawl, that they were very much getting into character, almost like stage actors. And he felt it was his job to kind of help them create the most interesting stage to play on and all of this. But then he gets into this idea of like characters having destinies and then ignoring the rules to make sure that those destinies come true.
Yeah, don't just fudge the dice, ignore the rules completely.
Ignore the rules completely. And he was in part doing what Eisen was doing, which was trying to separate the players from the execution of the system when possible, so that they're never aware of this. This was like, really, like at first I was like, man, the symbolist guy's awesome. And then by the end I was just like, I literally hate you. Like you are the worst. Because
there was so much.
I know there was so much potential. I know, but he literally got to the point where it's like he's talking about actively deceiving the players. Yeah. And if you have intelligent players, which everyone essentially did at the time, it seems like, because you're in these like hyper intellectual little places in like universities and whatnot, they'll see through that.
Yes.
And it ruins the game. It absolutely ruins the game if you're like, okay, so no decision I ever made actually mattered ever. And my first instinct when that happens is break the game immediately at that point. Because it's like, it's all right, start pushing every single boundary. If I can't die, if I have to do this destiny, like I'm
going to find agency somewhere.
If I have to burn the world to the ground, and
I bet you didn't plan for that.
But Eisen, on the other hand, really he wanted his main thing was you want the players to feel as though they were really there in the dungeon, and this is very much exactly where we are with these games. Is we want that experience, because once you've had those little moments of like the illusion coming to life and the game taking on a life of its own, like that's incredible. That is an experience that you're generally not getting from, strictly speaking, a war game. You know, you were not, because you were not immersed as a character on that battlefield. And it takes a certain level of imagination to do this, and a certain level of openness to the experience to actually for it even to be possible to have that happen. But Eisen wanted to curate that to such an extent that the execution of the rule system was to be done behind the GM screen entirely.
Yeah.
Characters would only describe what they attempt to do. GM lets them know if they succeed or fail. And so in this sense, he's almost kind of advocating, it doesn't seem like Eisen was at all about executing these destinies or this pre-plotted out, essentially what we now know as the railroad game.
Follow the rules, but don't let the players in on the mechanics. Don't show the man behind the curtain.
Right. And it harkens back more to the free Kriegspiel, which the Kriegspiel being essentially this wargaming exercise.
This 19th century war game.
And there were two kind of versions of this where you had an extremely crunchy version with the rules being exposed mostly to everybody, but the referee really being in charge of the execution of the system still. And then there was the free Kriegspiel, which had much less structure and rules to it. But the idea was more like try to simulate reality as accurately as you can.
Right.
And so this is another one of those things where it's like time is a flat circle. It's like we kept coming back to this, and it's coming up now.
That was like the penultimate proto RPG sort of IP or product out there. And again, people in the 70s recognized this and called out or called back to the free Kriegspiel as sort of like a main, maybe not a direct inspiration, but a main node on the family tree, right, of what led to D&D.
Right. And you have this constant argument, and it's still going on to this day, because it hasn't been resolved, because it's difficult to resolve this, is to what extent do you want systems that simulate the parts of the game, but at some point, if you get too granular with it, the game becomes unplayable. It grinds to an absolute halt. And again, this is an issue that is not solved. I think it's a game-by-game basis. You have to basically judge when you're designing a game, have to judge what actually needs systems, what is important to the simulation of this world.
But I think that's the key, right? So I mean, to go back briefly to Eisen, and we've talked about other subscribers of ours, mainly Primeval Fantasy, clued us into this term Eisen's vow. That vow being, the GM vows not to let the players in on the mechanics. And so you have a correct, what would you say? There's a correct desire or a correct feeling or mode of play that you're trying to preserve. But the conclusions and the methodology to make that happen, I think, are ultimately doomed. And we've talked about this before. It is laudable,
right,
to try to maintain the player's verisimilitude. But all, like in so many other things, all the good intention in the world does not necessarily make it so, such that what you're doing is going to be conducive to what you're trying to do. In the 70s, maybe you had some mileage in that way of doing things, because everything was so new and every game really was very, very different from table to table. But certainly in this day and age, with the ubiquity of the internet and rules being freely available, also D&D being sort of in the culture, that alone makes it impossible for this sort of wall to be set up and have it last more than...
Yeah, but and it's beyond that, though. I just think it's a bad experience for the game. Partly because it gets you into these issues of trustworthiness of the execution of the system. If I don't know how it's working and I can't see the results of die rolls and things like that for attacks or whatever, how do I know that the GM isn't doing these things?
Right.
Like, I think it ultimately, like, you would have to have people with such high trust in a GM that actually was completely honest the entire time.
In which, and if you had that, there really isn't a reason why you can't play Amber Diceless or something.
Yeah, but I hate it. I hate diceless.
No,
this is where I'm going with that, though. Is like, even like with something that like I loathe diceless systems because it was hard for me to accurately judge whether or not an outcome happened.
Right.
Which way it falls on success or failure, and having dice or some other resolution mechanic that is not simply me making a decision about it really improves the game, because it improves my confidence as a GM, and there is a level of trust at the table. Everybody knows that the chips fall where they fall.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
And that's how the game goes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with Eisen's vow it's just there's going to be too much temptation on the side of a lot of people. Maybe I wouldn't, fall into this category, but a lot of people will fall into the category of saving the players or killing them when they shouldn't, doing these things. And I think ultimately it is not the correct way to go about it. It also puts way too much cognitive load on the GM. Like, I don't want to be responsible running a game for knowing everything all the time.
Right.
And that's when you have players at the table who also really know the system, or at least know the core systems, that are relevant to their characters. That just makes the game better. The game, it makes the game flow, but it also, the mechanics, they do in a sense give you an idea of what your character is capable of.
No, there is value. It's like, I understand that interfacing with the mechanics at all, even if you have a very good system, there is this sort of switching cost. There is sort of a mental tax which has to be paid.
Yeah.
But there's got to be a mental tax to be paid, whichever way you go with it. And having trying to keep all of the mechanics, all of the artifice obscured behind the GM screen, it's not going to work for several different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
For the cognitive, the cognitive and the mental load on the GM, for the actual inability to censor the players outside of the table from learning the rules, even during play, even if you don't say it's attribute plus skill ranks equal, versus a difficulty modifier, on a long enough time frame, even average people are going to intuit that there is some kind of rule mechanism, the list goes on and on. So while the goal is laudable, that
just say that Eisen's wrong and we were right.
Yes.
We were clearly right.
As is always
the case.
Yeah. And well, I was going to go back to your sort of summation of like the discourse, because I actually think, again, we were correct, and we can solve this age-old issue of what actually are RPGs, what should you do, what is the appropriate amount of mechanics, what's the appropriate amount of character, I think that the reason the conversation was incredibly chaotic to start with, and why literally nothing has improved, in fact, things have only gotten worse, is this very fact. It's different people recognize different incentives and different, implications.
Yes.
To my point earlier, that are inherent in this activity called tabletop role-playing games. But just like trying to create a tool in the absence of like a physical problem that you're trying to solve, it can't be done. And so what is the one thing that RPGs do and do better than any other medium? What is the main differentiation between RPGs and video games and books and war games and novels and plays and all of these different creative enterprises? You have to try and answer that question to have a grounding from which you can have a perspective.
This is why I was so in agreement with Symbolist in the beginning.
Yeah.
Because he's like, if you don't even know what a role-playing game is or what role-playing is, can you even call D&D a role-playing game?
You can't.
You can't.
You can't.
If that's the case.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. We can and will solve this.
But I think it's character immersion.
Yes.
That is the one unique thing that this activity does and promotes and is geared towards.
That the other mediums cannot do. Cannot do.
Or can only do to like a lesser degree.
Yeah.
Again, it's like, you can play a war game just like people in the 60s did and assign attribute values to all of your tin figurines.
Yeah.
Yes, you can play Monopoly and try and role play it. You can, again, like, imagination exists outside of any of these things, right? I can look at a cereal box and pretend I'm in the Lucky Charms world. Mm-hmm. That's not the same thing.
Yeah.
And again, I could also choose to play a Powered by the Apocalypse game and ignore all of the cinematic moves and look at these people as pieces on a board game.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to achieve an abstract goal.
Right.
Nothing.
But that is what you're doing in a Powered by the Apocalypse game.
That is.
They don't understand that, but that is what you're doing.
Right. So like that, and no one really has taken that tack when either thinking about RPGs as such, or developing a game, or considering this fact as when a GM is trying to create a campaign for themselves, this is the starting point, right? If you have this starting point in mind, you have an objective. What would you say? You have an objective like reality, right? You have an objective standard with which to judge all the other types of ways that you could create or play a tabletop game.
And this was the thing that was so kind of irritating to me because, and I'm sure someone had figured this out, someone had played this way, but everyone seemed to be at odds with the idea that simulation and like these character-driven, more like story-oriented games could be compatible with one another.
Right.
And this is the thing that like where I think that the simulationist approach is fundamentally the correct one for the operation of the world in the game and determining outcomes and all of these things. You want the game rules and preferably the material to actually simulate what it would be like to be in whatever genre you're in.
Correct.
And a lot of games do that fairly well. But that does not mean that you cannot have character immersion within that. I actually think it provides the better basis for character immersion to actually happen and emerge. And like this is when you take a simulationist approach with character immersion and without having this predefined story, that's the unique experience. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that differentiates this from all of the other activities, you know?
Right. And not only can you and should you have to have character immersion in mind when you are trying to simulate it. Because again, having the core objective standard of character immersion, how much better or worse are these mechanics allowing me to immerse myself in a character?
Yeah.
When you keep that in mind, you have the natural sort of stopping point that prevents you from going over the deep, into the deep end, into absurdity, where you can have rules to measure fingernail growth.
Yeah,
and you
track your potassium levels.
Yeah, your potassium levels. And
you're getting low on magnesium, friend. You better.
Yeah, I need to track my macros. You absolutely can do that. There is nothing stopping you from writing a 3,000-page simulationist rule set that is logically consistent.
There's also nothing stopping you from putting on a helmet at that point.
Exactly. So, again, having character immersion as like the central axis on which everything else orbits.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. Every game is going to be different because this isn't material science. There isn't.
Yeah,
there
exactly.
Isn't mathematical one-to-one things that can be objectively measured and calibrated, but there is still a standard upon which everything else can be measured up to.
Yeah, exactly. And the whole point of a simulation is to be experienced or observed at least, and it's like observed by whom?
Right.
If it's just observed by me, the player, watching some Rube Goldberg machine operate itself, I'm sorry, I have no fucking interest in that. Right. If it's me putting myself in the mindset of one of the little people that we're imagining, and imagining I was there in this incredible environment in reality that's operating on these rules that I don't have any control over either. Just kind of like the real world.
Kind of like the real world.
Yeah. Doesn't that sound interesting?
What a concept.
Yeah, what a concept. And this is why, again, like we've said this a million times, why we don't think that these games are really about having fun. And
they're not about having fun at all.
The fun is not just for us, is not amusement. You can be amused by these things. That's totally fine. You can be, and it can be an entertaining experience. The fun comes from this deeper enjoyment of
Correct.
it. And the deeper enjoyment of it comes from like the simulated reality coming to life.
Yes. And that is one of many poisons that has been sort of in the environment for a very long time now.
And I don't think you can get rid of it, because it is honestly this whole thing of all these arguments being cyclical. Like, again, every generation has to learn good ideas from the beginning, like from the outset. You know, there is not this like onward march of progress that happens. This is not how history works. This is not how philosophy has ever worked. Good ideas come and bad ideas come. There's this kind of constant push and pull. You can see where bad ideas get re-implemented over and over throughout history to bad results.
Yeah.
And people have to learn the good ideas over and over and over again. And so I'm hoping, now that we have the internet and videos like this operating in perpetuity, you know, hopefully people can find the right ideas faster now.
Correct.
Be exposed to them faster, because I mean, the last decade of conversation on role-playing games, as seen through consumable media, through like YouTube and whatnot. And frankly, YouTube is just where every major conversation happens now. That's the way it is. Has been so abysmal. Has been so abysmal.
Well, so abysmal as to not even be
a conversation.
Really called a conversation.
There aren't ideas there.
Yeah, there aren't even ideas. I don't even know. I don't even have the words in this moment to really give an accurate appraisal of sort of what it is. It's so far below the standard of like even thinking about something.
Yeah,
that
it's like rolling around in the slop.
Astonishing.
Yeah, you're just rolling around in the slop.
Yeah, exactly.
And staring at, you know, gamer girl.
Right, very mid gamer.
Yeah,
girl.
very mid gamer girls telling you how to play the game, or just telling you how not to play the game.
Not even really telling you how to play the game. It's just they're abstracted pieces which sound good when spoken by a post-wall. Nerd chick. You know, it's not.
You have turned 28.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah, it's. They're pieces of thoughts, not even full thoughts.
Right.
And they are completely abstracted out. 5 rules for XYZ.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's like half the time they're not even rules.
They're not even
it's
rules.
like, here's a suggestion. Yeah.
Or they're not even about what the core topic of the video is.
It's like Shauner said, it's like every one of these videos that says, you know, like 10 best tips to make your game better. It's like you should say like 10 tips how to ruin the game, you know, like how to make things worse.
They all are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as much as we've joked about, you know, how worse things are, and they are, but in a strange, counterintuitive way, this book actually is a big white pill, specifically for the reasons you just laid out.
Yeah,
every generation does need to relearn these things.
Yeah,
and you had the same thoughts and the same insights 40 years ago that are being talked about now and being rediscovered now, which also implies that this, in some ways, isn't a climactic battle of sort of good versus evil in which, like, one side is going to be victorious for all time.
No.
As much as I would like to be right, and I know that I am.
Yeah.
You know, but
10 years from now,
right,
someone is going to be starting a podcast like this.
Correct. Hopefully.
Yeah. And they're going to be talking about these very things again. Right.
Which, what it means is we've already won.
Yeah.
It means we won 4 years ago.
Right.
It means we were preordained to
it was pretty interesting, though, too, because there was a lot of things, like even the whole women in gaming thing had been brought up before. But there was the form on these things slightly changes. And so there's been, I know in the profession of psychology. There's discussions of the therapeutic uses of D&D. And of course, there's the YouTube people who will tell you that every D&D session is a therapy session, and you should be, unloading your own personal stuff via your character, who is, definitely not a complete self-insert.
Absolutely.
But there were people talking about the therapeutic uses of Dungeons and Dragons at the time. And but it was, again, the form was slightly different. So I do just want to read one small piece of this. If Bachman's idiosyncratic perspective on maturity represents one extreme, there's ample evidence of how this opposite manifested. In another piece describing the benefits of role-playing, the therapeutic aspects of D&D, Tom Curtin recounted the game's efficacy in resolving depression and anxiety. Pretty interesting, right? Though his argument is for the salubrious comfort found in self-indulgent and often sadistic diversion. After describing the many difficulties he faced in real life as a senior in college, he reported, "I really feel rejuvenated after just frying some deserving and obnoxious hobbit. It's my favorite sport." He described a session where his party viciously tortured a captured orc, repeatedly healing it with a gem of regeneration to forestall its well-earned death, and admitted, "It was cruel, but we relished the poor orc's trauma. This episode was a great way to work off the tensions of an astronomy quiz."
Yes.
So in some ways, things certainly have regressed, because that was a much healthier impulse and a much healthier
much more
time.
based and true.
Yeah. But this is also why men enjoy video games, to blow off steam. It's like, I get to make people explode and kill things.
It is a violent power fantasy.
Right, exactly. And so anyone who is telling you that you should be playing D&D to unload your trauma, you're doing it wrong. You need to force the NPCs to experience trauma. That's the point.
Obviously. How could it be any other way?
Yeah.
Is anyone really going to say it's not fun to torture orcs?
Or barbecue hobbits?
Yeah, actually, hobbits are better. Even more worthy of...
Yeah, I completely agree.
Say.
I hate them. I love The Hobbit. I love the book The Hobbit, but...
The Hobbit.
The species. That's really what I'm getting at.
If you aren't a Baggins...
Sorry.
Get in the oven.
Even if you're what was it, the Saxville Baggins?
The Saxville Baggins?
You got to go too.
Yeah, well, you definitely have to go.
Yeah.
They took Baggins from Frodo, I think.
I know. He came back, though, and he got it back. Or no, it was from Bilbo, right? Or did they take it from him when he came back, too?
He sold it to the Sackville Baggins.
Okay. Yeah. That's right. Because he wasn't planning on coming back. Yeah. This was not there and back again.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's... It really is interesting how much... Again, it's like the old adages and the trite platitudes are true. Like, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But I think you're right. I think the existence of the internet, the prevalence of podcasts, the ubiquity of streams, and the easy access or the easy lines of communication that exist globally, people will forever have bad and horrifically bad
ideas. But the good ideas, they're not just written down and sitting in someone's garage anymore, these zines and everything like that.
Right, they're not going to die.
They're not going to die. And the more that people get interested in these things, they're going to want to find the actual interesting conversation. And it's being preserved now. It's like people understand the importance of these, psycho proto blogs that were being written and printed in people's garages,
right,
and stapled together. It's like when they find those things, those are gold now, and it's like, scan it, it's going online, it's going in the trove, it's never going to disappear ever again. And books like this are absolutely fantastic. I really, really hope that Jon Peterson writes a follow-up into the AD&D era, up through...
because this book goes from 1974 to 1980, if I remember correctly. And I would love a detailed examination and an exploration of of the 80s.
Yeah.
Even if it's just, again, another 6-year period, or even if it's a 5-year period from 1980 to 1985, that would be so interesting.
Yeah, it would be amazing, because that is when you get, and he does talk about that era at the end of the book, like briefly.
Yeah, very briefly.
But it's much more about the consequences of D&D exploding as this, massive success. Yeah.
Yes.
And the influx of these kids, and it was pretty interesting the way that they were described as, they're being totally disruptive to the game and coming in and knowing the rules by heart, which really upset a lot of the older GMs, because they're just like, shut the fuck up, let me run the game, like, get out.
People know the rules better than these these elders,
right?
These grognards,
right? But they also feared that AD&D was going to kill the spirit of all of that creativity that came out of OD&D, because now it is Gygax's word, because Gygax was very clear.
Yeah,
this is how you play AD&D. If you're going to change things, you're not playing this game anymore. And it, I think most people out there, and probably Jeff Rowe in particular, would say that nobody, that fear was not founded, because nobody played by the rules for the remainder of the time. But I would love to see more of the conversation that came out as different generations came in. People like Mark Reinhagen, the effects of newer games like Cyberpunk coming out, and maybe even into the 90s, because I'm sure there is so much to be mined there, and a lot of those people are still alive too, which is great. So you could dig them up.
I mean, this would have been the hardest period to catalog, and this is explicitly like an academic.
Yes. This is not.
This is an academic work.
Right.
It's meant.
MIT Press.
Published this again for the explicit reason to sort of catalog this unique thing, which very little has been written about, and I think he's right. Which is, no one is more surprised to find this book interesting and that he was right than me.
Yeah.
Because I was very skeptical. I thought this is so dumb.
Yeah.
Who gives a shit about about the history of D&D?
Gary Gygax.
About Gary Gygax. Yeah. But it was incredibly interesting. So I mean, if it was of value to catalog the earliest 6 years of this new thing called tabletop role-playing games, then therefore it must also be of value to sort of continue cataloging it throughout its history. Yeah. So if not Jon Peterson, somebody else, I hope will
but I honestly hope it's Peterson.
I hope it's Peterson too. He did an excellent job.
Jon, if you are somehow listening to this, please continue your work, because this was really something truly great. And there was a relatively objective perspective on this, and which was really, really refreshing.
And not only that, briefly, you're talking about surprises. This is an academic book. It is so exciting and engaging to read.
Oh, I know.
This is not dry.
It's not dry at all. And that was, someone said that they had heard that this book was very dry. And all I have to say is that whoever told you that is a fucking moron.
Yeah.
You're talking to someone who's probably illiterate, because this was fascinating.
Yeah. Excellent writing. There are a lot of names and publications, a lot of excerpts from these publications that are juggled around. And,
very well sourced. It has incredible endnotes at the end. So
written well. It flows well. It makes sense. And this is also very easy to reference after the fact.
Yes.
So I went back to several different sections and chapters and portions. Very easy to sort of navigate once you've read it.
Yeah, it's an achievement.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and with that, I think that's pretty much all we've got time for today. Yeah, but we are going to be doing this at least once a month. If all you guys out there in YouTube land keep sending us money, We're going to keep doing
Yeah.
this.
It's all going back to this and to other things we have.
So come find us at blacklodgegames.locals.com. Use promo code MIDWIT to get a free month, and you'll be able to interact with us. You get access to our videos 24 to 36 hours before they come out on YouTube, including this. Hello, local subscribers, and a whole bunch more. So definitely check us out. And with that, no apologies.
No compromises.